This is the 8th in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. In today's program, I will continue to address the question I raised last week. Specifically, can anything significant be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? I pointed out in the last program that many famous thinkers have had a rather negative view about human nature. For example, the Buddha. The Buddha claimed that anger, greed, self-centeredness come easily to us. Jesus, in one way or another, implied that we are all sinners. Plato did not believe in democracy. Why so? Plato claimed that the majority of people often do not exercise good judgment, wise judgment. Aristotle said this about human nature, and I'm quoting him. He referred to, quote, the wickedness of human nature, end of quote. And St. Augustine claimed that we have a predisposition to evil as a result of Adam and Eve's sin, which some Christians refer to as original sin. St. Augustine claimed that we must work at being good, that evil comes easily to us. Philosopher Thomas Hobbes claimed that human beings are instinctively selfish and ruthless. He also said any attempt to make human beings moral is a waste of time. Psychiatrist Carl Jung said this about human nature, and I'm quoting him. Evil, without man's ever having chosen it, is lodged in human nature. And Freud, in one of his most famous and classic phrases, referred to human beings in this way, and talked about human nature in this way. Freud said, and I'm quoting him, "Man is a wolf to man." And Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, in talking about human motivations, said there are only 3 human motivations. They are, according to Nietzsche, hunger, sexual lust, and vanity. And Shakespeare also, of course, addressed himself in probably all of his plays, in one way or another, to human nature. And in Macbeth, Shakespeare has one of his characters say the following: "In this earthly world, to do harm is often praised. To do good is accounted dangerous folly." And Marcel Proust, arguably the most famous and best of all French novelists, said this, and I'm quoting Proust: "I feel infinite sadness at seeing how few people are genuinely kind." What has 21st century science had to say about human nature? Well, you recall, in past programs, I addressed myself to this, but let me again, right now, give a very brief overview. MIT professor Steven Pinker has done much research about the present research or current research on the human genome. And Steven Pinker claims that we are wired by our biology for aggression. In other words, what Professor Pinker has done, among other things, is to confirm that Freud was right, that human beings are innately aggressive. Freud, of course, did not have the advantage of the research that's been done on the human genome, an advantage that, again, Professor Pinker of MIT has had. But I must also add that Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson claims that while Pinker is correct in believing that we are wired by our biology for aggression, also says that our genes predispose us to altruism. In other words, we are very complicated creatures. We may be wired for aggression, but also be wired for altruism. Indeed, so many of the famous thinkers have said that our salvation may lie in our complexity. The famous French philosopher Pascal put it this way: we have two natures, one bad, the other good. And the Dalai Lama, as I have mentioned in previous programs, claims that we may have an instinct for aggression, but we may also have an instinct for compassion. And it is interesting that the human species has produced such noble figures as Saint Francis of Assisi, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Albert Schweitzer, political dissidents risking their lives in many cases to fight for democracy in many countries of the world. And of course, the volunteers throughout the world, people who have volunteered to go to the poorest countries in the world, the poorest regions of the world, to try to improve the way of life of the people living there. Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist, I think provides a good summary statement concerning the complexity of human nature. Psychiatrist Jung said this: the self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. Good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins. Abraham Lincoln, you might recall, in his first inaugural address, appealed, and I'm quoting him now, to the better angels of our nature. The better angels of our nature. Of course, there is also the matter of the darker angels of our nature. The human heart, so many of the great thinkers have said, contains kernels of good and of evil. History does provide much evidence for the dark side of human nature. In past programs, I've alluded to slavery, imperialism and wars of conquest, religious intolerance and persecution, treatment of women, humiliation of other groups of people because of their skin color or social class, systematic efforts to make groups of people feel inferior. Examples of this: the United States and South Africa, where systematic efforts were made at one time to make black people feel inferior. And in India, systematic efforts to make the untouchables, a class of people in India, a poor class of people, systematic efforts to make them feel excluded and inferior. Gandhi said this about such efforts, and I'm quoting Gandhi: it has always been a mystery to me how human beings can feel themselves honored by the humiliation of their fellow human beings. In today's program, again, I will continue to address the question, can anything significant be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? Freud defines the problem, and here are Freud's own words: the problem before us is how to get rid of the greatest hindrance to civilization, namely the constitutional inclination of human beings to be aggressive towards one another. In past programs, I've raised the question, given our human nature, what fulfills us? And I mentioned that the great thinkers claim that among the things that fulfill us is learning about our own nature, learning about our emotional makeup and how to deal with it. Emotional education, in other words, learning better how to deal with our anxiety, our anger, our sadness. So much of television program deals with this. Oprah Winfrey, I think it's fair to say, often has programs dealing with emotional education, programs aimed at helping her viewers to become better adjusted emotionally. And of course, Dr. Phil, who now has his own program, and as I recall, started as a guest on Oprah Winfrey's program. And of course, many self-help books zero in on the idea of emotional education and what we can do to better educate ourselves about our emotions and therefore live more tranquil lives. But I think that so many of the self-help books leave out another kind of introspection, another kind of learning. The idea is that self-fulfillment also includes confronting the evil in us and the potential for evil in us. This kind of introspection, this kind of self-examination means not lying to ourselves. It means not denying our human nature, not denying the dark side of our human nature. It means specifically facing up to our aggressiveness, our selfishness, lustfulness, mask-wearing, envy, anger, status-seeking, power-seeking, desire to impress others, spitefulness, sarcasm, vicious gossip, engaging in conspicuous consumptions while millions go to bed hungry. Always blaming someone else for society's problems. Oh, society's problems are the fault of minority groups, or gays, or feminists, or immigrants. Also, how many cheat in school and business, but are quick to accuse others of immorality? The great thinkers claim that self-deception is pretty much universal. The idea that it's not at all unusual that human beings think they are more decent, more generous, more moral than in fact they are. Do we do our jobs as conscientiously as we could? Do we arrange things on our jobs so that we do less work than others and make more money? Do we commit the sin of pride, thinking we're hot stuff? We do, of course, sometimes sin by doing nothing. There are the so-called sins of omission. For example, going along to get along, going along with an inefficient, maybe corrupt bureaucracy so as to get a promotion. Again, never speaking out about the inefficiency and indeed perhaps the corruption in the organization. Also, knowing that some people in the world are being treated unjustly, but we do nothing. That's a sin of omission. Edmund Burke put it this way. Writer Edmund Burke said this, and I'm quoting him: "All that is necessary in this world for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing." In Judaism, there is a prayer that addresses itself very specifically to these sins of omission. It's part of a series of prayers called Prayers for Yitzchak. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And in this, again, Jewish prayer, it says the following: God, forgive us for the sin of keeping silent in the face of evil in high and low places. Again, God, forgive us for the sin of keeping silent in the face of evil in high and low places. Psychiatrist Carl Jung has put it this way: the evil that comes to light in man and that undoubtedly dwells in him is of gigantic proportions. Jung, by the way, was not a particularly religious person, but he was a student of cultural history. He had studied many different cultures. A key question is this: are we happiness stealers or happiness givers? How many people consider themselves to be very religious and very spiritual, even though they are much more interested in competing with people, impressing people, than in helping people? Blaise Pascal, the devout Catholic and famous mathematician whom I've often alluded to, said it's important for human beings to have self-respect, but he said it's also important for human beings to have self-contempt. And there is a parable that Jesus told that I think illustrates Blaise Pascal's point. Jesus tells the parable of two men going to the temple to pray. One of the men was a Pharisee. The Pharisees were very observant Jews, observant of the Mosaic law. And this Jew began praying thusly: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, liars, adulterers, rogues, or even like this tax collector who is praying not far from me. I give to charity and I fast twice a week. The tax collector was standing far off to the side. He could not even look up to heaven, but instead was beating his breast and in a shameful way, saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus then goes on to make this comment. It was this man, the latter, the tax collector, who went home justified rather than the other. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all those who humble themselves will be exalted. By the way, that passage comes from Luke 18, 9-14. A certain degree of self-contempt can be good for us. How so? It can lead to humility. And what does humility involve? Humility involves an acknowledgement that we all have a dark side. Indeed, all the religions teach that each of us has a dark side. It's also an acknowledgement. It's also an acknowledgement that Tolstoy was correct when he said, there is no person so good that he does not need forgiveness. There is no person so good that he or she does not need forgiveness. This, of course, includes the Pope, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, all heterosexuals, all homosexuals, all liberals, all conservatives, Rush Limbaugh on the right, Al Franken on the left. We all need forgiveness. Promoting decency in the world, promoting love, promoting justice begins with each of us. It begins with daily introspection, daily self-examination of our consciences. Carl Jung put it this way: it is important that human beings should not overlook the danger of the evil lurking within them. He went on to say, and I'm quoting Jung, only the fool can permanently disregard the conditions of his own nature. In fact, this negligence is the best means of making him an instrument of evil. Our lack of insight deprives us of the capacity to deal with evil. And the Dalai Lama, I think, sums this up very well. Here are the Dalai Lama's own words. We must criticize ourselves. How much am I doing? How much am I doing about my anger, my hatred, my jealousy, my pride? These are the things we must check in daily life. Jesus, of course, also emphasized introspection. He warned us that we tend to focus on other people's sins and not on our own sins. And in Luke 6, Jesus illustrates the point with these words. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but you do not see the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. Remove the log from your own eye, and then you will see more clearly to remove the speck from your neighbor's eye. Freud, Jung, Adler, all of the great minds in psychology have claimed that we are all deniers. We are all repressors. We all often deny the truth about ourselves to ourselves. Historian Will Durant put it this way: There are few things in the world so unpopular as truth, and the backbone of men and states is a concatenation of romance. Jung said this: "We prefer to localize evil in criminals and groups of criminals while washing our hands in innocence and ignoring the general proclivity to evil." The German philosopher Nietzsche said what prison teaches criminals is that some sinners are punished for their sins and some aren't. Indeed, Nietzsche went on to say that some people are rewarded for their evil, that some people get job promotions for their evil, that sometimes dishonest politicians, dishonest educators, dishonest people are actually rewarded on their jobs for the evil that they do. Can you imagine what prisons would be like if all dishonest people were in prison? Can you imagine what prisons would be like if all sinners were in prison? We talk about the problem of overcrowding in our prisons today. Can you imagine how overcrowded our prisons would be if all sinners were in prison in America and indeed in the world? And in that case, who would take care of the infants, the toddlers, and the small children? Again, the question, is there anything significant that can be done to get people to behave better towards one another? This program has focused on the need in every person for personal introspection and a daily acknowledgement that one is not as good a person as one should be. What else can be done to promote introspection? Well, our schools, I think, can do a far better job. Specifically in history courses. History is a great means of teaching about human nature. Tolstoy said this. Tolstoy said, "The aim of history should be to teach humanity and nations to know themselves." Again, Tolstoy said, "The aim of history should be to teach humanity and nations to know themselves." A common question in all history courses should be, what does this tell us about human nature? In other words, when students are studying slavery or imperialism or religious intolerance and persecution or the treatment of women over the centuries or the U.S. Constitution, the students should be asked, what does this tell us about human nature? How many of your teachers asked you that question when you studied history? Also, I think if we are to promote introspection in our society, there should be required courses in psychology and philosophy beginning in the first grade. These courses should be courses in self-science. It's interesting. We have courses in mathematics and foreign languages and biology, but no course in self-science, no course specifically tailored to help students understand themselves and others better. In other words, to understand their human nature more clearly. How many people have left school with a mind full of irrelevant facts and dates, but little understanding about themselves? How many relationships, marriages, for example, went sour because the parties to these relationships were lacking a basic knowledge about human nature? Also, I think it's fair to say, organized religion can do much more to promote introspection. I think organized religion can pay much more attention to the garden variety sins. For example, the various ways in which people steal happiness or try to steal happiness from other people. The many varieties of unkindness, sarcasm, and other forms of harmful speech, often based on jealousy and envy. Also, as I indicated today, organized religion must get the idea across to people that when we don't do our jobs conscientiously, we are sinning. The police officer, The teacher who doesn't do his job, her job, in a conscientious way is sinning. Also, bullying and exploitation in school and the workplace, that's a serious sin. Bullying and again, exploitation of others in school and the workplace. Vicious gossip and the money sins. The money sins. Do rabbis, ministers, priests, in their emphasis on the sex sins, are they often negligent in talking about the money sins? Why is it, by the way, that so many prominent clergy seem to talk about little else than the sex-related sins? Aren't they allowing their congregations who don't engage in these behaviors to feel unjustifiably morally superior? Are there supposedly very religious, very spiritual people who have never committed a so-called sex sin, but who in their everyday dealings with other people are cold, calculating, indifferent to other people's suffering, and not especially moral in trying to get money and prestige? What do you think? Finally, as usual, I would like to end with a quote by Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."